Welcome to DesignOps Island Discs, the podcast from Zero Height that navigates the calm waters of DesignOps and design systems with your host, me, Luke Murphy. I'm a design advocate at Zero Height, and I'm talking to the best folks in DesignOps and design systems to navigate us through what it takes to float it within your design org. So we're up to episode 2 of season 3, which is being recorded live in front of a studio audience. Well, not really, but on the internet. And I'm joined by Arielle Benedek, PM for the web team of Encore, Spotify's design system, which I'm very excited to talking to you about what it is to be a PM on a design system. So prior to Spotify, Arielle worked on internal tooling at Condé Nast and BuzzFeed, amongst many other things. Without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Arielle.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So I suppose we should start at the beginning. So what was your journey into design systems like?
So I think I'll really start at the beginning here of my career, because I think that's always an interesting insight for some people. So I started off in customer service at an e-commerce startup in 2013. And I didn't know, I came from a humanities background. I was a poli-sci major, had no idea what I wanted to do, like talking to people, like solving problems. So I started off in customer service and got, great experience with customer empathy. So if anyone has not done a service job or worked in customer service, I highly recommend it. Great skills to have all around. So I definitely started off there and you learned about product in the process and how dynamic the industry is and how you don't really have to be technical to be in this industry. So after working at the startup, I moved on to BuzzFeed, and that was kind of my first intro to design systems. We had a small fledgling design systems there called Solid. And I didn't know what it was at the time, but it was starting to get hot in around 2015. And all I knew is that our developers were very happy. And that's kind of where it started out. And then when I was at BuzzFeed, I worked a lot more on internal tooling for our community team, our social media directors, our editors, our video producers, all of the people who make the machine work and who produce and distribute great content. So worked there for a few years and really got my hands dirty in design tooling and engineering tooling. And then moved on to Condé Nast, where I was placed on a platform team that was tasked with the very daunting task of merging 2 design systems into one. Oh. So at the time when I joined, the Condé Nast International and Condé Nast US were merging into one company. And my team was the first cross-Atlantic team and cross-design system team working to build a unified design system from the ground up. So very difficult, very interesting project, trying to merge 2 different rationales of design and 2 very different systems into one that could support our, 30-odd global brands, hundreds of countries that we supported. So it was really a huge challenge, but very interesting. And that's where I kind of fell into design systems and really, really loved the space.
Oh, I suppose that brings us on nicely to sort of the next part around PMing, because I know that a large part of a PM's job in whatever space you're in is, wrangling the chaos. And I can imagine that when you're trying to combine 2 design systems into one, it's probably a fair bit of chaos wrangling. So I suppose, part of that, what, for anybody who doesn't know, what would you say is, the core job of what a PM does on a design system?
Yeah. So at the core, PM job is going to be different in any team, any company that you're at. But the main tenets of a PM job, product managers, for those who might use PM in different contexts, is the same. It's ultimately about ruthless prioritization, being able to really understand the customer problem, define the customer problem, create a roadmap to help solve those issues. And your stakeholders are internal and external. I think that that's one of the key differences, is that it's a little gray. It's not really black and white when it comes to design systems, because you're ultimately working for your internal stakeholders, that is internal designers and engineers, UX writers, anyone at your company, but your product gets seen by millions of people. The buttons on Spotify are created by our team, the icons, the typography, the color themes, those all come from the design system team directly and are inherited through these product teams. So that I think is an interesting one, because you're kind of serving two different customer bases. I think another thing that's different with being a PM in design systems over a direct to consumer external customer team is how you measure success. And I think, you know, we could have this discussion with other PMs too, and we can discuss the difference. I've had it before, but it's very hard to measure success quantitatively in design systems.
Yeah.
So that's a really big challenge, and I don't think anyone has solved it. I've talked to a bunch of other design system teams, and we're all just trying to kind of create a story and write our story through metrics. And you aren't just pushing one metric, so you can't just tie your impact to MAU. And then I would say, like, the last thing that is quite different and a little more difficult with being a PM on design systems is it's hard to iterate. So when you're an agile team working on an external consumer product, you're constantly shipping tests, you're A/B testing things, you're shipping products, you have V1, V2 versions of those products. We do that in design systems, but it's a lot harder, because at the point that people start adopting your products, it's stable. And then if you start changing the core functioning of the components on them, it breaks their systems. So it's very easy to ship something, but it's very easy to break things. And it's harder to kind of, you know, it's hard for people to adopt breaking changes the bigger you get.
It's interesting, because I suppose that's like, it's a core part that I'd see as a real difference between the PMs on design system or internal tooling generally, I think, and sort of, you know, direct to consumer. Excuse that motorbike going past. Is the community building that you have to do, and it's not something that, you know, a lot of direct to consumer you know, folks have to deal with, whereas I think it feels like it quite often lands in the PM's basket of lots and lots of things to do. Have you found that to be the case, that, you know, that community building, and it's almost like the very wide internal stakeholder management has often sort of landed on your plate?
Yeah, I would say it can be a huge beast, and dealing with a variety of use cases. So for instance, we have teams that work on internal tools at the company. We also have teams that work on the consumer facing applications. We also have people who work on creation tooling here. How do you create podcasts? How do you create advertisements? And so the basket of use cases that we need to build for is quite large. And I think negotiating the needs, you know, something we hear often even from internal stakeholders is on data heavy products, you know, analytics tools, tracking tools, stuff like that. They need denser environments for their components, because there's so much data and there's so much information that they need to display. And then on the consumer side, there's more space, there's more room to be colorful and more, you know, aesthetically pleasing, focus on that instead of having to squish so much data into a small place. And so we have to negotiate that as well. So it's like, how do you create a component library and a set of kind of design guidelines that can change based on modes, accessibility, you know, increasing screen sizes. We work on a variety of different surfaces, from iPads to cars to just someone pointed out this morning, we're on airplanes now. We have cards in the so, you know, we have to think of hundreds of use cases across all these different modes and devices.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, I can imagine that must be a very different mind. I mean, that's just the different mindset as well from, you know, PMing on a really big product that has, you know, a million different sort of facets to the product. let alone then having to go one step deeper and doing it on a systems way of thinking, where you've got both the internal customers and the external customers that you got to kind of worry about and deal with all of their requirements and needs. And I suppose apart from that sort of mindset difference in terms of, having to be very community minded and having to be, it's not just about being user focused, but making sure that you actively keeping people on side and keeping them engaged in the process and the conversations. Do you think there are any other big sort of mindset differences between PMing, design system, or even internal tooling generally, and that more sort of direct to consumer, that say if there was somebody who was wanting to go into this and say, oh, do I have that right skill set? Do you think that there are any of those, like, you must have this kind of way of thinking?
Good question. I think the best skill set, or at least the skill with the greatest value, I think, when you're on design systems, is collaboration. You're not working in a silo, and you're constantly working across, again, platforms, modes, devices. You're serving all these different use cases. But something that we do here really well, and we've gotten a lot of success with it, is we're embedded and working extremely closely with our accessibility team, our localization team, experts on performance. And so if you have those close relationships with those teams, that is where the value really shines in the design system. And so being able to collaborate with them and just really never work in a silo. You're not just pushing your agenda, you're pushing like a whole user experience forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes 100% sense. So I suppose, so you mentioned that you've been involved in, design systems in one way or another since 2015, which is, that's OG. That's right back. I think that's even before Brad published his book, but anyway. So you've had the experience of like working on different scales of design systems. And I'm really curious as to hear your thoughts around, what do you think are the main sort of markers in a design system as to when you should have a PM involved? Should they be involved from the beginning, or is it more like once you reach this particular stage?
Yeah. So I think first off, I'm sure your audience knows this, but it is pretty rare to have a PM in a design system. You have all sorts of titles. You have lead designer, lead design system. It often starts from design, or the needs that design has, or the needs that engineering has. So I think there's not a lot of us. So if you're out there, contact me. I want to talk to you. But what I would say is yes, and so when you don't know where to begin, and you need someone to help define what that MVP is, minimum viable product, and you can really think of a design system like a product in that way. Like what do you need to get going? Like what is going to get people on the path to adopting something that's useful to them? What need are you serving? What jobs to be done? And are you performing as a design system? Some people, and this depends on the company, some people focus on speed and some people focus on quality. Really, you do both and you help both aspects of the design system. But if you're going to focus on one over the other, over index on it, your strategy will be different. The components you build are different. The complexity you build into the components are different. So to help define that, I think it's always helpful to have a PM at the start. Dan Mall just talked about this at Converge last week, but thinking about what the next component is, and in your mind, a lot of us think, oh, button, that's the first thing. That's extremely complicated. And, he brought the example up of Uber, where what's their vision? What's their mission, right? They're trying to get people from one place to another. So what component actually helps them achieve that vision? Not a button, a map. And I think that was a really interesting insight, and thinking about the use case for the users, not just, or for the internal stakeholders as well, not just, okay, well, there's a design system handbook and we start with buttons and that's where we go. So, so I think the beginning is always helpful if you can That's great. Product managers also know how to advocate for your products and to get investment there. But I will also say another point that makes sense, which is kind of what happened with my team, is when communicating with stakeholders and defining the customer needs comes at the expense of shipping anything.
Yeah,
that's a good moment as well, because it's a lot of work. Like you said, community building and reaching out to your stakeholders and defining those needs is a lot of time and a lot of effort. And if you are only doing that, you don't have time to ship anything, and you probably have a small team. So you need someone to kind of bear that load to allow your team to focus on actually building and shipping something.
yeah, I think that makes 100% sense. And I will just say, as a shameless plug, if anybody wants to watch that video of Dan's talk, highly recommend it. convergeldn.com. You can put your email in and request the videos there. But anyway, I'm done plugging now. But no, I think that's the most succinct way I've heard of the most succinct answer I've heard of when product is needed, and I 100% agree, because I think you're right what you said around there aren't enough product people in design systems. And the report that we did last year, How We Document, I'm not just going to plug everything. But in How We Document, it showed, I think it was less than 10% of people who filled out the report were in the product space. Which was, not that surprising, but still pretty depressing. And I think that it's one of those things where it's, we need to start thinking a lot more seriously. If we are thinking of our design systems as product and infrastructure, then, we need the resourcing to actually make that work as successfully as it could do. So it makes sense. And I suppose with that in mind, what do you see as the main challenges in sort of doing product within design systems, or like the product focus challenges within design systems at the moment?
A lot. I think
that's we've got 3 hours if you want.
I think that's what makes it fun, because it's complex and it's difficult, but I think it's hard. It's a hard job. So a couple of things. I mentioned earlier, it's hard to measure quantitatively. I think we all try and use different ways of measuring success. And, the golden metric we're all trying to get to is like, how am I improving productivity? How am I reducing time to market and making lives easier for everyone that I'm providing this tooling for? And frankly, it's a really difficult thing to do when your teams work autonomously, when they use all different types of tooling. You can't really tie something to Jira necessarily. If people use different cards in all these different ways, you're using many tools across design engineering. I think people forget sometimes that engineering are huge stakeholders in design systems, not just designers. Like, engineers are the ones who they want to use it. They're saving so much time by using it. But, trying to kind of measure, well, what aspect of the design system helps speed things up for them, at what point? So I think measuring is really hard. I think negotiating a spectrum of needs in the design system. So there's teams that are going to want to do drag and drop. There are teams that they just want like fully set building blocks. They want to drag in an entire form. They want to drag in an onboarding flow. And other teams want much more customization. And sometimes that the both use cases make sense for different contexts. And so you have to figure out ways to support that scale from configuration to customization, and provide both of those experiences so people don't just eject, right? That you serve a variety of needs. I think there's also a hard job of communicating the value sometimes, because there's a high upfront cost in adopting a design system sometimes. And so you need to really communicate the value prop of a design system to get traction, to get people to start adopting it. And I think one of the ways we do that is by including accessibility and localization built into our libraries, and really providing a blueprint for the perfect component, and for a lot of these best in practice guidelines for designing accessible, inclusive experiences. And then I think define the contribution process. Like, when is that never a difficult thing? Amy, who talked about it also at Converge, about how we work in a capitalist society, but contribution is such a socialism norm. And how do you really do those two things together? So, I mean, that again hasn't been solved in my opinion. And I think the last point really is that getting ahead of product team needs. So there's always that point in the beginning where you're kind of working on your own priorities, your own roadmap. But then in order to really gain traction and gain that adoption, you need to dovetail your roadmap with product roadmaps, because you need to show that you're serving those needs. And so we work really closely with our stakeholder teams to figure out what their roadmaps look like for the next 3 to 6 months. I think what's difficult is that, especially at a company very innovative and developing quite quickly, it's difficult to get ahead of that because they pivot quickly to the needs of the business. And frankly, they don't know what components they need 6 months from now. They know what they're working on for the next quarter for sure. Anything beyond 3 months can be a bit fuzzy. And so you need to figure out how to get ahead of that and what pieces you need in place to suit their needs. Because otherwise you're just going to kind of be catching up to them all the time.
Oh, it's good to hear that it's not just smaller companies like us who have that problem as well. That's so many interesting things that I want to jump in on there, but I'm gonna wait because I'm pretty sure that all of those questions are coming from the audience afterwards. So let's keep it high level for the moment. Well, I'm really curious, especially because of you've had a really interesting path. I mentioned that you've worked on a bunch of design systems, but you've also worked on a bunch of internal tooling. What do you wish somebody told you at the beginning of your career? What was the piece of advice that you wish you had, or what would you go back and tell your younger self now?
Yeah, definitely ask the stupid question. People say there are no stupid questions, and I think I believe that. I'm a big inquisitive person. I'm always asking the question. But there was one PM that I worked with at BuzzFeed, shout out Swara, who would ask the obvious question, why is this necessary? Or what does this thing actually do? And I think if you don't ask those questions, because you're scared, I was scared early about being perceived as a non-technical PM and that it would impact my ability to grow and respect from engineers and such. But I think in the end, it hindered my development to not really get ahead of some of those questions and understand the why behind certain decisions and how they're made. So I think just asking stupid questions and being the person who does it, because people will thank you for it. People want to see someone who they see as smart and, respectable, ask the question that they're wondering too, because half the time people want to ask that question. They're just too scared to. So, yeah.
And I mean, to be honest, I think that sometimes people hide behind jargon. I know it's something that I'm very bad at accidentally turning everything into a TLA. So it's that's a 3-letter acronym. I think I blame my time at Microsoft for that. I suppose let's, before we get on to the audience questions, we've got a couple more. And a nice big, easy question that you can very easily answer. If you had a magic wand right now and you could change one thing within design systems today, what would that be? Nice and easy.
One thing.
One thing.
Oh boy. A truly magic wand, self-sustaining documentation.
Oh.
I mean,
yeah.
How many times have I discussed documentation in my career? Don't even know. I was on a documentation working group at BuzzFeed.
Yeah.
We did a hack day to get things documented. You got to be innovative with that stuff.
Oh, because I was going to say, I'm really curious. Like, have you had any, massive wins with documentation? Because it is an area that I think it's a pain for a lot of people to do it and do it well and keep it up to date and do it in a sustainable way.
I think the biggest win is having a UX writer on our team. Shout out to Becky. I think it's not just documenting, like that has to be done. And I think keeping stuff up to date is always going to be a problem, and you can automate it, you can try to, but it's always going to be a difficult thing. So it's something you just have to think about all the time. But I think having someone who can think about content strategy, which is exactly what our UX writer is doing, is, where are you communicating? How are you communicating in the right time to the right people with the right information? What's too little? What's too much? What is the source of truth? I think having someone help define those standards make it a lot easier for everyone in the end.
I've been starting to try and preach to everybody recently that, because everybody says, never start a design system without a designer and an engineer, because you otherwise won't succeed. And now I'm very much trying to preach that no. Design, engineering, content. It's the third integral part of any kind of successful design system. And I think that we can probably put product in there as well, and it can just be a four-legged table, which is a nice sturdy shape.
Agreed.
So before we switch it over to the audience questions and send you off to your desert island, we have the most important question of the day. You get to take with you to the desert island a book, an album, or a piece of music, and one luxury item, so that you can while away your days in the sunshine, in the sand. So first off, let's start with, what book would you take to your desert island?
Harry Potter.
Oh, just the whole thing? If
I can. If not, I would have to pick like either the first one or Goblet of Fire 4.
Really? See, I just assumed that Prisoner of Azkaban is everybody's favorite, but...
Oh, I'm sorry. That is bottom of the pack.
I think we now have to do a second podcast just about this. But in the meantime, for this one, we can move on to the music. We can move on from your wrong answer to the music. So what piece of music would you take to the island?
See, I only prepared for the book one. I would say maybe some Bon Iver, just some like really chill, introspective music, right? So Harry Potter's for the stimulation, and it's like, if you're alone, you can even create sub-stories off of all these characters, and so that's great for your imagination. But Bon Iver for the chill vibes.
So just, chill out to some Bon Iver whilst creating some questionable fan fiction, right? And then finally, luxury item that you'd take along with you as well.
I've been really into this silk sleep mask recently.
Oh, yeah.
I did not realize it is like a sleeping aid for the face.
To be honest, sleeping masks, I thought that they were a terrible, terrible idea. And now I just can't sleep without one.
Not quite there yet, but it's definitely, you have a bad night's sleep, you put it on and it helps you.
Oh yeah.
Shut down.
Gets you into the right headspace. I think that's perfect. That's perfect. Especially with the sun beating down on you. Okay, let's switch it over to the audience questions, and there are some great ones in here. And a few bits that I'm really glad to see that they sort of picked up on what you were saying, because there are a few things that I want to dive in on. You mentioned in your answer around the main challenges, you talked about localization on the design system, which is, again, so we actually included localization in the How We Document survey last year. And I'm pretty sure it was like less than 1% of people said that they currently localized. I just wondered if you could sort of shed a little bit of light on not only sort of the reasoning behind localizing, whether you localize the product and the docs, or and also like how you actually might start going about that and thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So localization can, again, be very expansive or can be very narrow. And I think you need to first define what aspect you're going to focus on. So we are very lucky, and we have an all-star localization team internally, and they focus on process. They're also going to be taking on a lot of the heavy lifting around our technical, like our libraries that we're using, our translation processes, our translation tooling. So what we focus on as a design system is making our components localizable. So that is, we don't hard code anything.
Yeah.
So do not hard code. If you ever want to make a global library, or if you have ambitions as a company to grow into other markets, just don't hard code. You're going to make your life living hell at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So don't hard code.
Just to clarify there, you're talking about basically when you've got any kind of content, do it as a string as opposed to like as a sort of variable, basically, as opposed to hard coding any content, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say there's some maybe minor exceptions there. Like if you're talking about ARIA labels and you have close, it's always going to be close the button. So
Yeah.
you can hard code a couple of things. Maybe that's a bit strict. So really making things very like strings, just empty strings that people can give their strings to. That also makes it easier, not even just for localization, which is the key. It's like this makes it easier for different teams to use your components in different contexts. So, no one would ever hard code a button, but if it said push on product A and press on product B, maybe it matters to the context, maybe you do need to kind of change that. So if you have a string that makes it easier to customize the language, we did the same thing in Condé Nast, like all of the brands had different voices. And so sometimes you want to speak in a different voice for a different brand. So it works just not for localization, but also for sub libraries, sub brands. So we make everything localizable by doing that. Also, you have to keep in mind about iconography. That was a really big thing that we learned recently. When to mirror icons, it is not totally clear. You can't just mirror every icon. Also, some icons don't work in other cultural contexts. The one that blows my mind is the question mark mirrors in Arabic, but not in Hebrew, even though they're both right to left languages. So really, like, there are nuances in that. And you have to consider that, and you have to consider the metaphors of what you're using too. Like we had a $sign for our currency, but that's obviously very Western centric. So how do you have a different, or for receipt, right? And like, so we changed the iconography of the receipt to be more global. So there's a lot of those cultural contexts you have to take into account too.
Yeah, it was one of the things that because I used to work for a company that did a lot of localization as part of the core of what we did. And it was the difference between translating and transliterating, where it's actually getting people who have enough knowledge where they can take the original concept and the original text and say, okay, this is what's going to work for my culture. It's an incredibly nuanced thing. And like, it's one of those things where as soon as somebody suggests to me that they're going to localize their entire product using AI, I usually shudder, cringe, and then die a little bit inside, and then go on about a half-hour rant. So thank you to Sophia for that question, by the way. So there's another great question here from Sabine around, and I'm really curious because you folks you work on the web team at Spotify, but you do have the design system does cover all of the native platforms, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you integrate native Android, iOS, and web accessibility into the design system? And sort of, are there any challenges around that?
That's a good question. So yeah, I have a counterpart team in the Encore core system, two teams. One is the foundations, which deal mostly with our tokens and icons and such, and typography. And then the mobile team, which is meant to be a mirror library to ours, right? So I think there's difference in how you add accessibility from a coding perspective. I'm no expert in how you code iOS and Android, so you'd have to ask my engineers. But when it comes to accessibility, a lot of what we've learned from the team here is that it's there are some basic rules to live by, I think, regardless of platform. We actually have 2 accessibility experts in-house that focus on the different platforms, so they're pros. But a lot of things can be extrapolated across platforms. So for instance, if you're thinking about form fields, which are historically extremely hard to make accessible, there are some basic guidelines that we provide in our docs that can cross platform. So for instance, keeping the error messages below the box so that they're not in the box and they're related contextually to what happened before it, or not having placeholder helper text because that disappears as soon as you start writing. So those types of things are just absolute basics that are agnostic to platform and that anyone can use in their designs.
That's pretty good. Yeah. So I'm curious here as well, and it's okay if you can't talk about it because of sort of proprietary information. But we have a question here from Charissa, I think it is, who would really who'd be interested to hear about the Spotify design team's tool stack, sort of, and what you use or interesting parts maybe within it, and if there's any part of that that you particularly love and would advise other people to go out and look at.
Oh boy.
Even if it's not the actual tool, but just the general, idea of the tool.
Yeah, any tooling that I'm particularly passionate about.
It's a weird question to say when you put it that way.
To tell you the truth, not really. It's not exceptional. Like we use what a lot of people use, Data Studio to do analytics. We use Coda to share a roadmap. I think some insight about tooling that I also learned recently working with the accessibility team is a lot of the tooling we use at any tech company is not accessible itself. So we were working with Tomasz, who's a blind engineer, and we had to use Google Docs for the most part because a lot of our tooling wasn't accessible. So I would say the tooling that I like best is tooling that's accessible to people and that, we can actually work together. I think it's really limiting right now, and it's getting better, but it takes a while. So, shout out to tooling that makes everyone be able to contribute.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I do think that it is one of those things where, it's not only sort of internal tooling from outside that you bring in, which I think it is definitely a problem with, but especially with internal tooling that you build yourself, accessibility, and I don't know, things like delight as well, making it, or just good UX are quite often things that end up, cut out of the MVP of a lot of internal tooling, where it's like, these should be table stakes. These should be the basics of what you're doing.
Totally.
Anyway, and I suppose on the similar note, when, looking internally at your team and the way that you guys do stuff, curious around like, what the kind of like composition of your design system team is in terms of like roles, and if you have any particular, well, I know that you do have some particularly interesting roles in there, and if there are any that you'd like to call out as special, or ones that you wish other people would have.
Yeah, we're truly blessed to have a very robust team and a lot of special disciplines. So our team composition is pretty standard. We have designers, engineers, PMs, but our unsung heroes of design are program management. I mean, without program management, it's like a whole nother skill set of coordinating and communicating and making the design system a core tenet of ops, right? You're familiar with that. And like, how do you train people? How do you onboard people into the design system? So we work really closely with DesignOps. They're awesome. We have a UX writer, like I said, who's amazing. We work really closely with the accessibility and localization teams. And we just hired a staff typographer. So that's an exciting role that we just heard about. And super excited to see where that goes. I've heard of variable fonts. I mean, what's that? I'm excited to learn more. Yeah.
Having seen that particular staff typographer speak at a whole bunch of conferences this year, I am very excited to see what comes out of Spotify now. All right. So we have so thank you to Charissa for that question. So I have a good question here from Laura, especially from like the PM side of things. Do you use any frameworks for prioritization internally, or have you in the past that you're particularly fond of?
Good question. I think the biggest framework I've had to kind of create for ourselves, which is how we prioritize stakeholders internally, because like I said, we have hundreds of websites actually at Spotify. You don't realize it, but we have hundreds. They're marketing sites, they're ad sites, they're landing pages. There's a lot of tooling that we offer artists and marketers and podcasters. So there's actually hundreds and hundreds of websites. And it's a huge ecosystem and extremely hard to map out. So I think something we had to do pretty early on was define customers that we could serve the greatest amount of both internal users and impact the greatest amount of external users. And so really for me, it's like, how do we define that priority level basically, and where we focus our efforts? Because I think you can go really wide or really deep with the design system, and frankly, we're still figuring it out. You know, do we focus on our top few customers and go super deep on them, or do we get them to like a bare minimum level of adoption that is like stable, and then we work on bringing other products into the fold, other customers? So nothing in particular from like a PM framework perspective, but I think sometimes you run against needing to make your own frameworks to help you prioritize.
Yeah, definitely. I think that makes sense. It's something that I've definitely found in the past in my previous lives of PMing. Is quite often you need whatever works for your particular problem set, right? So you can usually start with a framework and then completely adapt it, rip it to shreds and adapt it to whatever it is that you need. Thanks to Laura for that question. We have another good one here, which is really interesting since you mentioned the DPM on your team as well. So this one's from Evan. So I was curious if you have design management on the team, and how do you collaborate, and how do sort of roles overlap and differ? And I'm interested in expanding this out between the PM, the DPM, the product manager, the design program manager, engineering managers, if you have them, and design managers. How do you basically collaborate and coordinate amongst those four people? Are there any particular challenges there? Any advice that you give for people?
Yeah, actually, I think we also are still kind of finding out the finer details of that relationship. I think what's really nice is that we all share the burden of everything with each other, and then we essentially we have a group of leads, and we talk once a week, and we bring all of our priorities and bubble them to the top, and then we kind of delegate from that point. So I think the general buckets, as we kind of see them, is DPM really helping us with our internal external communication. You know, how are we framing ourselves within the company? How are we communicating? How are we being prioritized within the company? How do we work cross-platform with all of these different stakeholder teams? Also, education, onboarding kind of falls into that bucket as well. And then any kind of cross-program strategic initiatives that we want to push forward, and helping us really like craft a message for that, for the whole org. Engineering, we have really focused on delivery, which is a bit of a shift from what I'm used to in the past, which I kind of love, which is engineers will figure out how to ship the thing you need, and they'll do it in whatever way makes the most sense to them, and let them do that. And then I think it gives product a lot more room to focus on strategy and constantly be thinking about the future, and constantly be thinking about what's next and what's coming ahead, and how do we grow, how do we adapt. And I think having that separation has been really helpful, because it takes me out of a lot of the project management day to day, which I think often is what ends up becoming the PM role as well. They end up adopting a lot of that. And then something I think that is something I want everyone to think about is like the thankless work of team building belongs to everyone. It is not just the PM. So I think, shout out to Tice, who's my EM right now, and he has done so much work to build a team culture and care and think about the team health and socials and swag and all of those small things that take up so much time and so much effort, but like having someone to share that burden with, and it not falling on any one role in particular and being able to kind of spread that across everyone is great. So I think if you have a star team of that table you talked about, I think you'll be in a really, really solid position to just, share the load of all of the work and craft your own buckets of influence.
It sounds like an amazing team to have.
Oh, yeah, it's an amazing team. I can't say enough good things.
Thank you very much to Evan for that question. Next up, we've got a question from Mark. So what areas, you mentioned sort of documentation as a problem space that has been a problem space in a lot of the places you've worked at. What areas do you find the most difficult to document, or have the most problems with documenting?
I think the hardest thing is the conflict between wanting to meet people where they're at, and at the same time wanting to have a source of truth. And so I think that's where our, content writer, content designer, UX writer, all similar things kind of comes in, is helping us define that, where people need things and when, because at the end of the day, I really do think that you need to work towards the lowest common denominator, and people will unlikely read your documentation unless you send it to them directly and this is my answer, read it. So I think you just have to operate with that as a base assumption and not be too altruistic about it and think people are going to really go out of their way to read stuff. Of course, there are people that do and they're awesome, but like oftentimes you're going to probably need to forward people stuff. You might need to create a Slack bot that recalls your documentation and sends it to people when they ask. Like there are a lot of ways to go around it. So I think that is probably the biggest challenge to still be figured out, is how do you meet people where they're at, and how do you just basically agree on like what is the source of truth and how to reinforce that and make sure that people know that as soon as they join the company, and even 5 years after they join the company, that they just know where to go.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm wondering whether you'll have a very similar answer to this question, because I think that, the whole meeting people where they're at and that balance. There's a good question from David around what recommendations would you have for an org who's just starting out on their governance journey of a design system that has been very organic up until this point? Do you have any, advice for how to take it to that next level?
Oh, governance. Whew, what a topic.
It's an easy topic, I think. Yeah, we can cover it off in about 2 minutes, I think.
Yeah, okay. Governance. So, advice. I think the biggest thing I learned, especially moving from Conde to Spotify, which have very different visions and rationales for how the design system is meant to exist, how they're built is very different. I think the biggest takeaway, the thing I've learned, is that you can't force people to do anything. So don't try. No, I think
it's a piece of advice that I think a lot of people need to hear, because it is most people's, I'm speaking from my own personal experience here, it is the standard way of approaching it, of just going, I know the best way to do this, I'm going to make them do it this way.
That's the thing. I think it's a false narrative to think that you can't really force anyone to do something, and I think it will backfire. So I think there's nothing wrong, and I think that there is a degree of buy-in you need from leadership to be able to reinforce the communication of what you're trying to achieve with the design system all the way down. But I don't think the answer is locking people into something that they cannot use and that is more frustrating to them than it is useful. So this is maybe a bit of a cop-out, but I think build something that's really useful and really easy to use and delightful to use, and something that helps people speed their lives up. So focus on that, and the rest will follow to a certain extent. But I think In terms of governance, I do think that the core is sacred in a way. And I think that's where this whole, question of contribution comes in. And that's why that question is so hard to answer, because the core is sacred. Like the core of a design system is meant to be agnostic, is meant to serve the widest use cases, is meant to be reused in a variety of contexts. And so if you open up governance to like a straight up contribution model, especially early on when you don't actually have capacity to get eyes on anything, you're going to run into issues of tech debt very, very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay to say, we own these 10 components. You can't touch them. Like, these are the tried and true components. You can't change them. If you want to customize them, we'll build in like escape hatches that you can do that, but you cannot change the core system. But let's say someone wants to build a component that doesn't exist in the library. I think those contributions are the easiest types of contributions, those kind of green sky, blue sky contributions where it's something net new, right? And so even if that team hasn't done all of the legwork to make sure it works across all customers that need it, at least you can still advise them how to do it in a more scalable way. And then your team can always adjust that and fix it kind of later. But I think if you are operating with a very small team of people, which a lot of us are, then you're going to have to open it up. But I think open it up in the right way to the right people. Like, I think you need to be cognizant that like new contributions are definitely easier than old contributions. And the last thing I'll say about that is be really particular what you choose to be part of the core, and like what to your core design system, what are those components that define the system, that give it its brand character, that are also maybe more difficult to make accessible. Like, what are those core contributions that will matter the most to the business at the end of the day, and focus on those really hard. And then anything outside of that can be a little more open and free.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, it's what you were talking about that Dan Moore was talking about at Converge with the the most important components. It's not necessarily what you would think are the sort of core components, because it's not necessarily going to be your form inputs and your buttons and your heading stack. I don't know. That's seems to be the things that most people start with. But I also really like that concept of not necessarily, especially on anything that isn't part of that core set, like not demonizing detach. Like it is okay to detach if there is a reason for it, because it's not like the product designers who work on the teams that aren't in the design system don't know what they're doing. They are experts at their job. And if they feel that they need to detach something, there's probably a reason for it. And if it's laziness, they'll get kicked in the butt for it later. So
exactly. I think you need to there needs to be a good reason, obviously, but if they build something, and frankly, if you use data to back it up, like if you want to test a square button versus a round button, you can absolutely do that, but tell me why it's worthwhile, come back. I think one of the main things that we communicate to our stakeholders is that we want you to solve user problems. Your job is to solve user problems. Our job is to we already solved the basics. We already are doing the hard work for you. We're maintaining the hard work for you. This is just going to make it easier. You don't have to spend time on a border radius. There's just no reason for it.
Yes. I mean, but that's the thing is, I think that if we do start from that position of trust with the internal users, like the users of our product, we do need to start from that level of, there's a really good chance that they're going to do the right thing. And if they don't do the right thing, hey, maybe we should be looking into the reasons why they're not doing the right thing, because it might be, it might be a sign of a bigger problem and more systematic issues. I think that's a really great place to finish up there. I was going to see if I could squeeze one more question in, but I think all of them are way too meaty. But thank you so much to our audience for the brilliant questions that have been asked today. Thank you so much to you, Arielle, for joining us on DesignOps Island Discs. It's been brilliant. We'll now set you afloat to your desert island where you can chill out with some Bon Iver and practice your Wingardium Leviosa. if anybody wants to follow Arielle, the best place to do that is probably on Twitter, I'm guessing.
Sure. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
Therelzoe, Therelzoe.
Yep. And is there anything else you'd like to plug?
Just read our Spotify design blog. We're always coming out with cool new discussions, and we'll probably be writing more soon about our design system. So keep us posted. And also, if there's any PMs out there that do want to talk shop on design systems, I'm in product Slack, or reach out to me on Twitter. Brilliant.
As always, this podcast has been brought to you by Zero Height, and I would be remiss to not mention that. We're a design system documentation and management platform, if you don't know, and you can jump in at any point and create your first style guide for free by heading over to zeroheight.com/podcast, although I'm sure a lot of you have already done that. Make sure that you do add that last bit to the URL, because then it lets my bosses know that I'm doing the right thing and where you've come from. So with that, we're going to set you afloat and say until next time, bon voyage.